There you go. Look at that. I'm getting good at the whole Zoom thing. It only took 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah, I think I will remember for the rest of my life how when things started going south with the pandemic, it was just a few months before the start of our grant round. And we'd had all these in-person, we do in-person site visits when we learn, who's interested in applying for funding, and we go out and we meet with, we bring our team, we drive around all of Puget Sound, we drive like 2,000 miles in a course of 3 or 4 weeks. And obviously we couldn't do that. So we switched pretty quickly to virtual, and I think we were actually maybe even using WebEx at the time. I'm not even sure, because we used to use WebEx a lot, and I had terrible internets until just actually a couple of months ago. So I drove my old minivan to Tish's house, and I parked my minivan in front of her house, and her husband would bring out the extension cord so I could be all connected, and it was close enough to her bedroom so I could get the Wi-Fi. So I was on her Wi-Fi, and we did all of our site visits virtual from my car.
Virtual, yeah, wow.
And I got a really bad back from that. I had a bad back anyways, but that was cool to start. So
it revealed when everybody had whose internet was good and whose wasn't. That's for sure.
Yep. So let's see. Looks like people are rolling in. We have 23 participants coming on. So you can see the panelists and attendees. So I don't know if you can see that, Gary and Catie. At the end of this, one of the things we can do, and I can go over this a little bit, depending on how many people are here, we can adaptively manage this. And Darren, maybe you can kind of help me with that. People should be able to chat or Q&A, and we can see who's got questions. People could certainly even put in questions throughout the course of the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, when we're ready to, if there's time for questions or something like that, or a dialogue, we can see what the questions are. And I can actually bring people in. I can promote people from attendee to a panelist, and then they could actually talk or share their question in person, or depending on how it is, I could just read the question as well. So we'll just kind of see how things go, if that sounds okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. That part, it's hard. I always find it hard to see what's going on in the chat.
Yeah, that's no problem. That's why you have me and Darren. That's our main role. I'll just give a quick introduction at the very beginning, and then I'm just here for support. So we have about 40 participants as you guys are logging on. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. We just got started, or actually just 1 minute here. It's almost 9. It is 9 o'clock. So people are probably ending their 8:30 to 9 o'clock meetings, or trying to log on here at 9. So while we're letting that happen, I can probably just do introductions. Let's see if this is, yeah, so I can't see. Can I see? Oh, I can't see my presenter view. Now, are you guys seeing presenter view?
Seeing the slide.
Fantastic. Okay. Wow, we're doing all the things just right. Well, let's get started. Let me move this out of the way. So thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Jay Krenitz, and I'm the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program Manager. This is our learning program webinar, one of many as part of a series. We're so grateful to have Gary and Catie here today. And they're going to be talking about their project assessing the effects of estuarine restoration on bird populations in northern Puget Sound from Ecostudies Institute. So the foundation of ESRP is embedded in a really strong scientific background, largely through was called the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Projects. And ESRP continues to invest in that work so we can inform how habitat restoration projects and process-based restoration projects should be designed and what our expected outcomes could be, and it improves our ability to have the kind of outcomes that we really need. So this is one of those projects, and that is the ESRP learning program in one of these projects. So there will be a link to this recording, and we'll put that up on the Salish Sea Wiki. So our objective with doing those projects is so that we can learn and do this adaptive management cycle. So ESRP as a whole, we fund implementation of projects, and there are lots of other people and funding communities and local governments and tribes and people trying to restore and protect our ecosystem. So it's our job to support the learning that happens through projects like Gary and Catie's and help to bring that to the broader community, so that once we learn from that, we can bring it to the practitioners and then change maybe how we implement our projects on the ground. This is really hard to do. So this is one of our attempts to try to figure out how to do that. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction to Gary and Catie. So Gary Slater he founded Ecostudies Institute in 2001 and has worked to identify situations where eco-studies knowledge, experience, and skills can be most effective towards advancing the conservation of birds, other wildlife, and their habitats. Gary has nearly 30 years of experience in nonprofit administration. That is a testimony to his resilience, because it is a lot of work to manage nonprofits. Doing avian research, conservation, working in the Pacific Northwest, South Florida, Venezuela, and the Bahamas. This is great. This is my first time reading Gary's bio. And most recently, his work is focused on conserving imperiled birds and prairie oak habitats. His research interests span a wide variety of applied conservation issues, including the reintroduction of the ecology of passerine bird species, impacts of management on avian populations, and demographic factors limiting small populations. So let me, in all honesty, I have to tell you all, Tish had to leave town for a couple of weeks on a bit of a family emergency, and so I'm taking over, which is why I haven't read the bio until today. So just want to let everybody know that. So Gary's passion for birds began as a child watching chickadees at the family bird feeder. He received a BS in wildlife science from Purdue University and an MS in wildlife ecology from the University of Florida. Outside of his office, Gary enjoys spending time gardening, brewing beer, and hiking. Sounds like I need to go have a visit with Gary Slater at some point. So Catie Porro has worked in a diverse monitoring and research studies devoted to bird and habitat conservation across 10 states from east to west. She joined Ecostudies Institute in 2021 as avian conservation specialist, working on prairie bird projects at JBLM, Joint Base Lewis McChord in Olympia. She began studying bird communities at estuarine sites in northern Puget Sound in 2022, and is continuing work to support the goal of developing a partnership-based region-wide bird monitoring framework. She earned her BS in biology from Virginia Commonwealth University and an MS in wildlife and conservation ecology from New Mexico State University, with her thesis investigating burrowing owl nesting ecology through the Great Plains. So that was a wonderful bio. We're honestly just so grateful to have you guys here today to share your study with us. And thank you for all that you're doing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you guys to share yours and start your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I don't know where that bio came from. I don't know who that person was. Thanks everybody for attending the presentation, obviously on an early Friday morning. Today we're going to talk about a project that is assessing the effects of estuary restoration on bird populations in North Puget Sound. This project really began at the same time the COVID pandemic started, so it feels like a lifetime ago, but we're excited to be finally presenting the results of this learning project that was funded by ESRP. I want to start off just by acknowledging the two co-authors, Catie Porro and Matt Hamer. They did a lot of the heavy lifting on this project, especially Catie, who's conducted a lot of the field work these last couple of years. For this talk, I'm gonna start off the presentation, then pass it off to Catie, and then we'll come back at the end to wrap up, talk about next steps, and then we'll open it up for questions. So next slide. I want to, for this group, I'm going to kind of skip over the introduction about estuaries. I think everybody's probably pretty informed. We know that estuaries have a tremendous conservation value, perform valuable ecosystem services. We also know that they've been really significantly impacted in Puget Sound due to development and a variety of other factors. In terms of the effects of that estuary loss and degradation on birds, unfortunately, we don't have great quantitative information on the historical abundance or their long-term population trends, but all anecdotal evidence really points to substantial declines over the last century. So even though we know there have been significant declines, Puget Sound estuaries still support regionally and globally significant bird populations, especially waterfowl and shorebirds during the wintering and migratory stopover periods. Puget Sound estuaries support about 92 species across multiple taxa, and includes everything from sort of the small passerines like noisy and boisterous marsh wrens there on the left to the very secretive marsh birds on the right, and then to sort of the impressive congregations of shorebirds and waterfowl. So next two slides there, Catie. And one more, yeah, thanks. So those species that really rely on estuarine habitats in Puget Sound for food, shelter, and reproduction. So in Puget Sound, conservation of estuaries has really been driven by estuary restoration to help alleviate the impact of sort of habitat loss and degradation. To date, most of the justification for restoration was driven to recover commercially and culturally important salmon populations, and that has been where much of the monitoring has been focused. I would say that that's been changing quite a bit over the last few years. But overall, monitoring has been more limited for other animal and habitat values. And so we're still learning about the full spectrum of benefits and cost of restoration. And this holds true for birds. Can you go back one? Yeah, thanks. Sort of the lack of information about the consequences of estuary restoration on birds does have a number of implications. We know there's a diverse set of stakeholders in the region that are invested in bird populations. That includes the hunters and the birders, the photographers. It also includes many of the tribes that have strong cultural interest in birds. And all of those stakeholders have a significant impact on local and regional economies. Unfortunately, the lack of knowledge about the effects of restoration on birds has led to some stakeholder conflict, which has ultimately led to delays in implementing restoration projects. The lack of information about the effect of restoration on birds also limits our ability to link restoration benefits directly to bird conservation objectives. And in my view, this is a missed opportunity because nearly all the major water bird conservation plans really highlight estuarine restoration as a conservation strategy. And then finally, we don't have very much information on how the practice of estuary restoration influences bird populations, such as the creation of starter channels. And this limits our ability to provide recommendations for guiding the science and practice of restoration. All of these challenges have been highlighted by a sort of a parallel and ongoing multi-phased effort that's been led by members of the Peace Marine Bird Working Group, and that includes Audubon Washington, Stillaguamish Tribe, WDFW, and Ecostudies. And the first phase of that project really was an inventory of restoration projects, and it found that most estuarine restoration projects did try to incorporate an avian monitoring component, but methods were really varied, objectives were unclear, and funding was limited, leading to sort of a lack of significant conservation outcomes. And this has been followed by subsequent phases aimed at developing a formal recommendation for a standardized avian monitoring strategy. We'll kind of circle around at the end of this talk and talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. But for this project, the goal of this ESRP learning project was really to begin addressing this sort of lack of information about the effects of estuary restoration on birds. So we had 4 objectives. We wanted to develop develop and implement a sampling approach. We wanted to quantify and compare abundance and occupancy of birds across habitat types. For this objective, we really hypothesized that not all avian taxa were going to respond similarly to restoration actions. In effect, some birds were going to be winners and some were going to be losers. We wanted to look at or start investigating avian habitat relationships because we know habitat is a strong predictor of habitat use. And then finally, we wanted to sort of provide recommendations for contribute to a standardized approach to bird monitoring at estuarine sites. We focused the work in North Puget Sound because it has been heavily impacted by habitat loss. We know the amount of ongoing restoration is significant, and it has been identified as really important to some regionally and globally important bird populations. The 2 bays we worked in were Skagit and Port Susan, which are the terminus of the Skagit and Stillaguamish rivers, respectively. And for this study, we were really interested in sampling 3 different types of habitat: pre-restoration sites, restoration sites of various age, and reference sites. In previous work, we've tried a number of different sampling approaches and have always felt a little unsatisfied. For this study, we decided to use a cell-based sampling approach. We evaluated several grid cell sizes and ultimately decided that about 150-meter grid cell was optimal to maximize sample size, minimize problems associated with birds entering and leaving the cell, the challenge of counting large flocks, and also traversing a challenging habitat. So our approach was for each site and habitat type, we essentially selected an initial cell at random and then systematically selected non-adjacent cells with the goal of maximizing the number of cells across the site. Next slide. So we applied this across our survey sites and we ended up with 47 sampling cells. We had 15 cells at 2 sites in pre-restoration conditions of the island unit and what was called the Thurman property in Port Susan Bay. We had 22 cells at 4 different restoration sites that varied in age. And we had 10 cells across 4 reference sites. And so at this point of the presentation, I'm going to hand it over to Catie to talk about survey methodology, analysis, and results.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. So we conducted data collection over a 2-year period for this study from February of 2020 to September of 2021. But because of the pandemic during 2020, we had to discontinue surveys after April. So we were not able to complete all surveys during the late spring and fall of that year. We defined seasonal sampling periods that reflect each avian taxa's life history stages relevant to Puget Sound. Surveys targeting waterfowl and shorebirds were conducted in 3 periods: winter, spring migration, fall migration, and fall migration when shorebird and waterfowl populations are prominent in this region. Winter period surveys began when the hunting season ends for safety reasons and because hunting pressure likely influences waterfowl decisions on habitat use, at least during the daytime. Shorebird surveys were conducted at the same time as waterfowl surveys during the winter and fall migration periods. However, spring migration for waterfowl occurs earlier than for shorebirds, so survey periods don't overlap. Surveys for land birds and marsh birds were conducted during the breeding period from early May through June. And these defined periods have target taxa, but during all surveys, all birds encountered were recorded. During the shorebird and waterfowl periods, we use transect surveys. Transects are centered in the middle of each 150-meter cell, and surveyors walked at a slow and even pace, recording all birds within the cell, and aim to complete the transects within about 10 minutes. We conducted 6 transect surveys per cell per period, and these surveys are tide dependent because waterfowl and shorebird behavior is strongly influenced by water. So we conducted 3 high tide and 3 low tide surveys, aiming to have surveys be over a range of tide levels. Surveys could also be conducted from an adjacent dike when sites were flooded. During the landbird and marshbird period, we used point count surveys. These were 3 repeat low tide, early morning stationary surveys conducted from the center of the cell. Point counts consist of a 5-minute listening and scanning period, followed by a 4-minute call broadcast period to increase detections of focal marshbird species. All species encountered and their estimated distance from the observer up to 125 meters was recorded. During each survey, we recorded habitat covariates, weather conditions, percent of the cell that was covered with standing water during the survey, percent of the cell that was covered by vegetation, and the average vegetation height above water of the cell. In addition to creating single species models, we group species into clades or guilds to increase sample size, statistical power, and ease of interpretation. These groupings reflect similarities in life histories, such as habitat and diet preferences. We used 4 overlapping shorebird groups. The shorebird group included all shorebird species. The other 3 groups for shorebirds were peeps, marsh-associated shorebird species, and mudflat-associated species. Peeps are small sandpipers that often form mixed flocks and can be difficult to distinguish outside of the breeding season. And waterfowl are often separated into dabbling and diving groups. Dabbling ducks are the predominant waterfowl guild in North Puget Sound estuaries. Certain diving duck species were recorded at our sites, but had few detections and therefore not included in analyses. The dabbling duck group included the 4 most abundant species in the region, being American widgeon, green-winged teal, mallards, and northern pintail. So we use single season, single species, or clade models under 2 modeling frameworks. We compared occupancy and abundance across 3 categorical habitat types, being pre-restoration, post-restoration, and reference marsh. And we examined relationships of occupancy and abundance to habitat variables of the sampling cell. We used independent frameworks due to correlations between the categorical habitat type variables and the habitat vegetation variables, which prevented us from including them together in the same models. Habitat type models are intended to examine predicted avian response as agricultural sites are being restored to low marsh by comparing differences across our 3 site types. And the habitat variable models are intended to provide a better understanding of environmental characteristics associated with bird use and potentially provide information to guide stakeholders about those habitat features that will benefit birds. We selected 4 potential variables to examine avian habitat relationships: mean percent cover vegetation and mean vegetation height of all surveys for each cell within the seasonal period, channel area, and channel length. Percent water cover was used as an additional covariate in abundance models, but we were unable to include it as an occupancy covariate because it is not static across surveys. Channel area and channel length were correlated. We retained channel area. Vegetation cover was correlated with vegetation height during the fall period. We retained vegetation cover. We considered linear effects of channel area, vegetation height, and percent vegetation cover, as well as quadratic effects of vegetation height and percent vegetation cover. So our candidate model set consisted of all additive combinations of variables because we hypothesized that each variable could influence bird use. And we used AICC for model selection and averaging, considering models within 2 delta AIC of the top model as competitive and average parameter estimates. So this table summarizes the number of surveys that we completed by habitat type, also showing the number of survey cells within each type. In total, we completed 1,875 transect and point count surveys combined during all seasons from 2020 to 2021. And this table summarizes our sample size by taxa with the number of species and total detections recorded. We observed 21 waterfowl species, 19 shorebird species, 68 landbird, and 4 marshbird species. Okay, so on to the results. I want to note that this study was a learning project with a relatively small number of sampling units, so broader interpretations are limited. Some results may not be generalizable to the greater region, but rather reflect avian patterns at our specific study sites, which I will discuss more later in the presentation, particularly in relation to inferences about reference marsh use, as we only had 10 sample cells for that habitat type. For occupancy analyses, if a species was indicated to have an exceptionally low detection rate, we omitted that seasonal species or clade account from further examination, because this would not produce reliable estimates. For species and clades with a sufficient detection rate, we retain informative models that either indicated a significant difference between predicted occupancy of habitats, or indicated one or more habitats were likely or unlikely to be occupied based on a 95% confidence interval that did not cross probability of 0.5. In these figures, points represent predicted habitat occupancy probability rates, and error bars indicate the 95% confidence intervals. The top black bar represents pre-restoration sites, the middle bar indicates restored marsh, and the bottom lighter gray bar represents reference marsh. So during winter, pre-restoration and restored site occupancy was generally higher than in reference marsh. Although for dabbling ducks and mallards, the pattern in restored marsh was weak based on large confidence intervals. The island unit pre-restoration site is managed for waterfowl, and the site was indeed a driver of high occupancy of pre-restoration sites. We did not find evidence of an effect of habitat on the occupancy of American widgeon during the winter period. So during spring, mallards had high occupancy probabilities in reference marshes. Mallards were also likely driving the high occupancy for the dabbling duck clade in reference marsh. Whereas American widgeon, green-winged teal, and northern pintail occupancy was higher in restored marsh than both pre-restoration and reference marsh sites. During fall, the dabbling duck clade had a higher probability of occupying restored marsh habitats than the other 2 habitat types. We did not find evidence of species-specific waterfowl habitat type associations during the fall. And during the fall period, we had lower naive occupancy probability and relative abundance than during the winter or spring for waterfowl. This is related to our defined fall period, which is actually earlier than when most waterfowl arrive. We could not sample later in the fall because of conflicts with the hunting season. Okay, so now looking at waterfowl abundance. Abundance figures represent predicted number of individuals per survey and therefore provide estimates of relative abundance across the 3 habitat types. During winter, American widgeon and mallards had higher relative abundance at pre-restoration sites than at restored. Green-winged teal and northern pintail were similarly abundant in restored marsh and pre-restoration sites. All dabbling duck species models during winter showed lowest relative abundance in reference marsh. During spring, American widgeon and northern pintail counts were lower and approximately equivalent in pre-restoration and restored marsh. Green-winged teal abundance was high in restored marsh, and mallard abundance was highest in pre-restoration and restored sites. All species again showed lower relative abundance in reference marsh. For the fall period, we do not present data for American widgeon or green-winged teal in reference marsh or northern pintail in pre-restoration habitats because they were not recorded or had very few detections in that habitat type during the fall. So for green-winged teal, they had relatively high abundance in restored marsh with low abundance in pre-restoration sites. Mallard abundance was similarly low across habitat types. Northern pintail had higher relative abundance at restored sites compared to low abundance at reference marsh sites. Overall, shorebird detections were lower than expected, which I will also discuss more later in the presentation. I'm going to share some of the occupancy results for shorebirds. During the spring shorebird migration period, the occupancy probability for shorebirds as a clade was highest in restored habitats, but differences among habitat types were relatively small. For the other clade and species accounts, marsh shorebirds, peeps, least sandpipers, and western sandpipers, they all had high probabilities of occupying restored sites with lower occupancy in reference marsh and pre-restoration sites. In the fall migration period, the occupancy patterns for modeled species and clades was generally similar to those in spring. All groups, shorebirds, marsh shorebirds, killdeer, and the sandpipers had the highest occupancy in restoration marsh with lower probability in reference and pre-restoration sites. So of course, we are presenting only a subset of our results today. So I'm going to briefly recap and summarize the general patterns we found for avian use across habitat types. Dabbling ducks generally showed high use of pre-restoration and restored sites and low to moderate use of reference marsh, varying with species and seasons. For example, we observed an increase in use of restored sites during the spring. Shorebirds were more abundant at restored sites compared to pre-restoration and reference marsh cross seasons. Least sandpipers were frequently recorded in reference marsh, and we suspect that other marsh specialists such as dowitchers and yellowlegs would also show higher use in reference marsh habitats given a larger sample size with more study sites. Landbird passerines had high to moderate use of pre-restoration sites, low use at restored sites, and marsh-associated species being marsh wren, red-winged blackbirds, as well as aerial insectivores being swallow species, had high use at reference marsh sites. Of the 4 marsh bird species, Virginia rails and Wilson snipes had sufficient detections to conduct analysis. The 2 other marsh bird species, American bittern and sora, had only a couple of detections during our surveys, despite using playback to increase detection probability. Occupancy of Virginia rails and Wilson snipes for reference and restored sites was low to moderate, likely due to variation in vegetation cover across sites. We had numerous detections at our 2 densely vegetated restored sites, the Island Unit and Ziziba. I'm now going to share some of the general avian habitat variable relationships we found. Habitat relationships can help us address information gaps. There's a need for region-specific data throughout the avian annual cycle in order to define conservation and management objectives. Additionally, this information can aid in determining what are those features that can be considered by restoration ecologists and practitioners. We found negative associations for waterfowl and shorebirds with vegetation cover, although varying with species and seasons again. For example, generally when a cell was greater than 50% cover, we saw a decrease in occupancy probability, as with peeps in the top figure. Shorebirds are known to select for areas of low cover with exposed mud. These factors are associated with improved foraging efficiency. Vegetation cover was a major variable in predicting land bird occupancy and abundance. Most land bird species were positively associated with vegetation cover. This pattern was nearly consistent for marsh-associated passerine abundance across seasons, marsh wrens, red-winged blackbirds, and savanna sparrows. Increased cover provides refuge from predators and weather, increased nest concealment, and supports higher insect abundance. We found positive associations for waterfowl and shorebirds with channel area, again varying with species and seasons. Other studies have linked shorebird use of channels with greater prey abundance and improved foraging conditions. For waterfowl, we found evidence for this relationship only during the fall period when abundance and occupancy of waterfowl was considerably lower. One explanation could be related to the fall period having a drier climate. Therefore, channels may be more important at this time of year. However, there was a consistent positive relationship of waterfowl abundance to water cover. Overall, channels are likely important to waterfowl and shorebirds because they often retain water when the rest of the site has drained, providing foraging opportunities throughout low tides. Channel structure and size also influence plant succession and distribution, and therefore the microhabitats generated. In turn, providing areas of shelter as well as open areas supporting the variety of foraging behaviors associated with different species. So we know that there is a critical need to address information gaps around avian estuary habitat use in order for stakeholders and the variety of land managers in Puget Sound to make scientifically supported decisions. And there's been difficulty determining avian survey methods in previous efforts. This learning project allowed us to implement and evaluate a study design for bird monitoring in upland and estuary habitats. We collected and analyzed data from a limited number of sites, and our findings support that restored sites do provide habitat for birds, and that habitat structure varies dramatically by site. Restored sites are influenced by where it is located within the estuary and what practices were employed. The study design developed in this project is capable of addressing avian monitoring needs. Various statistical approaches can be applied to the sampling design, such as status and trend analysis, and the design is capable of adding other habitat and environmental covariates as well. It incorporates detectability through repeat sampling and recording distances during land bird surveys. It's scalable. We believe the grid cell system could be implemented across estuary sites to aid in answering broad scale questions. And it's also applicable to other marsh habitats such as freshwater or high marsh zones. There are also challenges. It is difficult to access intact reference marsh habitats. They are limited in the region and often require boats to get there. We suspect that the low use of reference marsh by waterfowl and shorebirds was confounded by our limited access to more extensive low marsh sites not adjacent to dikes and the associated habitat conditions, such as channel density and vegetation composition. This figure shows mean channel area at our study sites. It's generally low for reference sites with the exception of Wiley Slough. Adding more reference marsh sites will be important to evaluate whether restoration targets are successful and better understand the habitat factors correlated with estuarine bird use. So we observed a large number of shorebirds using habitats within our study area, both during migration and wintering periods, but we had a low number of detections for certain shorebird species. Some species, especially peeps, move frequently from location to location, so their habitat use can be ephemeral and hard to capture because they do not remain in one place for long. Surveys during high tide when sites are flooded also influenced our data for shorebirds because water depth at the time of the surveys may have been too high for the sites to be available to shorebirds, as opposed to waterfowl who will occupy a flooded site by floating. A recommended protocol modification is to have surveys that are targeting shorebirds be conducted at low water depth when habitats are available. And lastly, accessing estuary study sites is difficult and presented challenges in conducting our fieldwork. It's logistically and physically demanding. Completing these surveys requires trudging through deep mud and water. And most sites have deep channels that can only be safely crossed during limited high tide windows. Okay, and I'm going to pass it back over to Gary to wrap things up for us.
All right, thanks, Catie. So yeah, that really brings us to the next step. And sort of one thing, as we've mentioned earlier, there's been this ongoing and parallel collaborative effort aimed at implementing a regional avian monitoring framework in estuaries across Puget Sound, the Salish Sea. And if you came to a presentation earlier this week, you know that proposed framework is really focused on understanding fine-scale avian habitat associations and low marsh habitats. And that decision was made following a series of workshops and technical advisory meetings with managers and other experts. Many of you attending may have participated in those meetings. And that framework does intend to implement this grid system that was developed and tested in this project. Next slide. So the decision to focus on fine-scale avian habitat associations with this framework was really driven by the understanding that habitat features are really the strongest driver of bird use. And by understanding avian habitat relationships, we can sort of improve our sort of basic knowledge about avian life history needs throughout their annual cycle. We can better evaluate avian response to management, including restoration, which in turn can help us inform restoration design strategies. And then it can also help us generate testable predictions about avian response to habitat change due to other management factors or environmental conditions such as sea level rise due to climate change. I think one critical aspect to note about this proposed framework is that it does provide flexibility, though. We know that funding and grant obligations may drive a focus on measuring avian response to restoration through the full cycle of restoration before and after restoration. And the protocol includes modifications for monitoring pre-restoration habitats and adjacent levees and dikes. So it is applicable not only to just low marshes. So really at this point, we're thinking about the strategies, outreach, and communication needed to operationalize and implement this proposed framework. We know that unless you have a really large site level approaches to monitoring are going to be insufficient to sort of evaluate sort of those habitat avian responses to conservation and management. So we're working to identify those collaborators and partners that can help us do that. We're looking to identify potential sites and then obviously seek funding sources to support a regional monitoring effort. So our approach really invites participation, and we seek to build that common community of practice, and we'll certainly need to work collectively and collaboratively to collect the robust data needed to answer meaningful questions and highlight birds in both planning and policy decisions. So that ends the presentation part of our talk. I want to quickly acknowledge, have a couple quick acknowledgements. So the one person I want to highlight is Ruth Milner. She really helped develop the study design and long supported this work to better understand the effects of avian restoration on avian populations prior to retirement. But all the people on this listed on this slide really helped in multiple ways, either providing data, support, information, and made this project the success that it was. So I think with that, we are happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary and Catie, for that presentation. That was great. So as I had said in the chat, if folks were able to see, if you do have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And if you'd like, you can also raise your hand. There's a function in the participants area. You could raise your hand and I could call on you to talk. So we have about 15 minutes to have some questions or a dialogue. It's a great opportunity to talk with Gary and Catie. Like I'd said, the intention of this is to build this understanding, especially for ESRP, so that we can think about how this might impact the future of restoration projects, or as these restored sites continue to adapt. So I've got a couple of questions. I'll just get it started. So Tracy Sanderson has 2 questions, and she's asked, were your variables of channel area and length and water cover percentage relative to a constant tidal datum?
I could answer that one. So percent water cover, we recorded at the time of the survey, so that did vary. For the channel area variable, that would be consistent, and those were based on either existing GIS layers that were shared with us, or when the data wasn't available, we hand digitized those variables to get that information.
Okay. Tracy has a few questions. I don't know if you can see this as well. Did you see a difference between sites with different primary restoration drive, i.e. waterfowl hunting versus juvenile salmon? Or restoration purpose, perhaps? Yeah.
I guess I can try to answer that. I guess in terms of the restoration sites that we were looking at, I don't know if you're speaking about particular sites that were managed for waterfowl or hunting versus juvenile salmon. I don't know of any of our restoration sites that were done that were managed that way. So I don't think I can answer that question. I think in terms of your next question about, do you think your methods and our results are applicable to smaller pocket estuaries? Again, I think the methods might be appropriate. I don't know if the results are certainly applicable. I'm not as familiar with smaller pocket estuaries, but certainly I think our methods could be used within those areas.
I've clicked on the button that allows Tracy to talk. Tracy, if you did want to ask any follow-up. Maybe she doesn't have the ability to have her microphone. Well, go ahead and I'll keep going through the Q&A. Tracy, if you do have, let's see, somebody has their hand up. Let's try this as well. So let's get to Anna's question, and then we'll get to Jessica Cote.
Yeah.
What was the age of the restored sites used in the study?
So there was probably Catie be better to answer this. There's 4 restored sites. 2 of those were only a couple years old, for Allen Farm and Zizaba. And then Deepwater Slough was a site that had been restored, I believe, back in 2004.
Leckway,
What site am I forgetting?
Leckway, is slightly, I mean, I think it was a year or two before her island, is that right?
So 3 of the sites were relatively new and 1 site was older.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of pretty recent work to restore estuaries, as so many of you know, and there's a lot coming. So it's a good opportunity, I think, to collect this data. It's an exciting time. I'm going to let Jessica Catie have the floor here for a second. Is this working, Jessica?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Ah, there she is. Great. Hey, Jessica.
Okay. Hi. So I work with Tracy for Gary and Catie's information, so I can fill in some of the
Right.
gaps there. And so I asked some similar questions because we do a lot of work in pocket estuaries. So I think we're mostly curious about, well, one of the things that I'm curious is, given that all of your sites were in estuaries and large river deltas, how does that, it seemed like a lot of your sites were adjacent to each other, like your pre-restoration and your restored and your reference. So how does that affect like the sampling, the bird communities? Because again, we're specifically kind of curious about these pocket estuaries where it's freshwater right now and they're going to be converted to salt marsh, hopefully, but they're not adjacent to like this larger area, right? So we get this question about, are certain birds just like going to disappear after the salt marsh conversion?
Well, and that's one of the sort of the original hypothesis, is that, yeah, bird communities are likely to change, and we didn't sort of go into the diversity index sort of arena, but certainly some species are likely to disappear and some are likely to start using those habitats. So again, it's going to depend on habitat structure and yeah, percent water that is still available in those sites. The thing is, with most of the birds, so you certainly have a couple different types of taxa. You have these species like passerines that are going to be relatively resident, that are going to be there every day, all day, whereas things like waterfowl and shorebirds, which are more common in the winter, spring, and fall, when they're either wintering or migrating, but they're usually found in large congregations. And they're this taxa that are tending to move around with respect to tides, water availability. And so depending upon, again, the site and the vegetation structure, how birds use those will depend somewhat on those factors.
Okay. And then I'll just make a comment and plug, since I have you here, is that, so we're starting, Blue Coast and Herrera are starting a new project in July under the Learning Grant, looking at prioritization and like strategies for small pocket estuaries. And so I think you guys, your expertise on birds would be amazing to have and help and consult a little bit on that project to help us think about how birds play into those strategies and bird usage. So I'll let somebody else talk now. Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to reach out. That'd be great to talk about that.
Yeah. Lynn had a question as well, and so she said the chat wasn't working and maybe Q&A wasn't working. So Lynn, can you ask your question? Are you able to do that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Great, thank
Great.
you.
Yeah, hi. So really interesting. And I found, from just this limited exposure, I work in the Columbia, I thought the objectives and the methods all were great for your goals. But being in the Columbia and having an overabundance of some colonial water birds that are missing from other parts of their historical range, and I'm speaking specifically of Caspian terns, it seems like there could be another goal, another set of objectives, another set of methods that would apply to birds that have become rare or absent in, for example, northern Puget Sound. It just like I said, my limited exposure, just seeing this presentation. I haven't read any of your background documents. I'm curious if people talk about that in terms of your wetland restoration programs. Is there an aspect of it where you have the opportunity to bring birds that are more or less extirpated back to this area? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, one that we're often faced with, like with rare and declining species. I think the hope is that if you build the habitat, those species will come back. And the nice thing about birds is they are relatively mobile and can move more easily. And we did, this method is capable of picking up those species. So I think if there was a sort of regional monitoring effort in place, sort of understanding how and when birds might be expanding back into those habitats, we would be able to detect it. But I think that the question about reintroducing, or sort of essentially reintroducing, is a sort of beyond the scope of this project at this moment.
Yeah, I get that. That makes sense. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Lynn. Well, let's get to Corey's question. Corey Green asked, based on your surveys, does the evidence suggest increased numbers of predators on small fish associated with restoration?
And by predators, I guess you mean bird predators.
Well, let's go ahead and, Corey, you are now able to speak if you'd like.
Yes, I mean, predators that are birds that feed on small fish.
Yeah. I think this was really meant as a learning project. I would hate to make some large sort of statement about that. I think if you're moving a site from agricultural field to a restoration site, then and there are now fish available where there weren't before. I believe we'll also have more predators. Whether that has an impact on fish populations, I would not dabble my foot into that topic.
Yeah, I was mostly interested in what there's sort of the suite of birds that prey on fish, from kingfishers to herons, the mergansers, and so that suite, it makes sense that restoration, providing habitat for those kinds of birds, would attract them. And so I'm just, if that was borne out.
Yeah, I mean, certainly like I said, with things like greater yellowlegs, which are somewhat small fish specialist, and blue herons, for something like blue herons, which are generalist species that you can find in an ag field just as much as a restoration site. I don't think it's going to sort of increase the numbers of those predators, but for some species like yellowlegs and kingfishers who wouldn't be there except for the fact that the water is there and fish are there, yeah, you're definitely going to increase some numbers of predators.
All right, thanks, Corey. We've got a couple of minutes left still. We're doing good. Jenny Baker asked, how come you guys didn't go to Wiley?
Hi, Jenny. That's a good question. I'm trying to sort of, I think we were really worried about the challenges of working in that site. As you know, it doesn't drain very well currently. And so, yeah, I think it was just like logistically had some significant concerns about working in that site. And I also thought, well, my understanding is I think at the time we were starting this project, there was some additional restoration activities going on there, but maybe I'm thinking about a different spot. But definitely the challenges of working there just seem logistically pretty hard, that it doesn't dewater very often.
Well, we'll put a pin in that for next time. We'll do Anna and then Key, and then we'll get Eric Grossman. We'll see if he might get the last word here. So Anna had asked, based on your observations, was there a correlation between restored site age and bird usage or density?
No, I think one of the things that Catie brought up is like that restored site age, like vegetation is driving bird use and occupancy. And what we see is dramatic differences in vegetation response among our restoration sites, irrespective of age. So for example, a place like Zizaba, which was essentially restored at the same time that Farallon Farm and Luckway Island were, it immediately became vegetated, potentially due to the fact that it had starter channels created in it, whereas Farallon Farm and Luckway Island have stayed unvegetated and relatively barren. So those differences of bird use are probably going to be more likely driven by the habitat response, which is going to be due to a lot of factors other than restored site age.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see a lot of new questions continuing. The design techniques of these restoration projects, and how we learn about that, and how that vegetation responds to that. Greg Hood is doing some of that work right now, which is great. So yeah, all great questions.
And we did go into this thinking, oh, there's maybe these hypotheses with restoration age. And I think the more time we spent out there, we realized that could be a factor, but it's going to be related to vegetation structure and composition at the site.
Channel development and all that. So Key, the presentation is recorded. We will, it'll be on the Salish Sea Wiki, and we'll share it definitely. I'll work with Tish to make sure it gets out there. Maybe I can make sure to get an attendee report from this we'll see what we can do. Yeah, we'll do our best to get it out there. Trina Bayard says, if you like birds, join the PSEP Marine Birds Work Group. A little commercial for that. So let's get to Eric, and then maybe I can let Jenny Baker talk if she can. She can't talk. Oh, she can't talk. Well, let's let Eric go, and then I'll ask Jenny's last question. We'll wrap up.
Can you hear me?
There you are. Hey, buddy.
Hey, Aloha Friday, and great talk. I love that picture of the snag. I think I've been up there too. In some of your settings that are exposed to storms and waves, I'm wondering if you're seeing effects of these storms and waves, and if so, do you have a sense whether we can use that information to kind of assess what kind of concern and contribution we should be thinking about in terms of storm impacts in the future relative to just, let's say, the slow, steady rise of sea level on these bird habitat and suitability.
Are you thinking about anything specific in terms of like storms, like increase in large woody debris, or?
Yeah, and sort of like the slowing down of the marsh progradation and kind of the leading edge of marshes are probably more, impacted today, but it's just a small area that you look at. But going forward, do we, is that a concern, or do we worry more about slow, steady rise of sea level and inundation changing a lot of the vegetation structure, or a combination of both?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I would assume a combination of both. And I think that's where, like, having a standardized sort of broad scale avian monitoring approach would allow us to look at those changes over time and when those events happen. So we're still, with this framework, we're still thinking about what are all the vegetation components that we should be monitoring, or what we could be monitoring. But I don't know if we didn't see it in our project, but I think that's something to be aware of, that a monitoring effort in place would be able to look at some of the consequences of those factors.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Let's see. So Jenny, let's see if we can give Jenny the last word here as she's trying to get in. Yeah, so Jenny's talking a lot about, I'm sure everybody is aware of this, but I think it's important to point out as well, I think Jenny's going to, that many of these places have been cut off from their sediment supply for so long that's provided by the river, and so they're subsided. They're a lot lower. And, I think Wiley Slough right now, like you had said, it's holding a lot of water, but it won't be like that forever. Some other places, say Spencer Island and Snohomish, we plan on restoring that site. It's substantially subsided. So these places will just evolve through time, and the fish and the bird species will use these places in different ways through the future. So Jenny, I was stalling there, helping to see if you could talk. Are you able to chime in here?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Awesome.
Great.
Hello. Thank you, Gary and Catie, for your work. This is really fun to see. Yeah, I just brought up Wiley because as we look from a fish perspective about where to do restoration, there's all sorts of considerations. And what we're learning at Wiley is because it's subsided, it holds a lot of fish, much more than a higher elevation site in the same position relative to channels and where the fish are coming down the river. So I'm just curious. I get that there's logistical challenges. I would love to know more about what kind of birds are using Wiley. I can look out there and see them, and a lot of other people go out and look and see what's there. But anyway, I'm just curious, and it kind of relates maybe to the earlier question someone asked about, are you looking at wetted area and channel area relative to a certain tide, standard? Maybe that's getting at the same question about sort of the elevation of the site in some standardized elevation, and what kind of birds are using it.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess, I will say it wouldn't be for the lack of excitement about monitoring Wiley. And part of this was driven by obviously funding levels and what we could get done. So I definitely would agree. It would be great to monitor a site like Lockway. And we've, some of those more flooded sites we've talked about, monitoring in kayaks versus on foot. And so that's always an option, especially if we're expecting sort of long-term changes over time. I guess, the challenge is that I guess going back to your water level piece, it's sort of quantifying that at the time of the survey, how much water is there. There's the potential to be able to use elevation data, in the future if we had that across all of our sites, because that interaction between elevation, tide height, and water cover is part of the habitat that really drives bird use. Water, as we know, drives bird use too, just as much as vegetation does.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm gonna wrap it up here. And again, thank you guys so much, Gary and Catie, for coming and for doing this project. And it is hard to do this kind of work. And our program is focused on really directing this work so that we can inform the future designs, right, and the future placement, and what we think we're going to get out of these restoration projects. And inherently, we are a program that looks at holistic ecosystem restoration. That is a process-based restoration approach. And so while we're the estuary and salmon restoration program, we really care about those core kind of degradations, those processes that have been that need to be restored, and understanding how we do that work and what the functional responses will be. So much has happened in this world regarding salmon recovery, which is so important to all of us. But we at ESRP in particular, we care about all those components of the ecosystem. And we're particularly excited to dive into some of the birds components of this that just really needs to be done. So I appreciate your work, and thank you everybody for coming. And we'll end the webinar.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good Friday.